Can you describe what sort of data is most important to you?
Now, that's a really difficult question, Sam. And I think the reason, I'll tell you why it's difficult, then I'll try and answer your question. I think it's difficult because I've always really passionately believed that different types of data are important to address any question. Now, you listed some of the topics that I've looked at in my research, and they're all really challenging topics with many dimensions to them. I mean, HIV, for instance, has a physical component to it when people are infected and so on, and their physical health outcomes. But there's also a very big psychological dimension to that. And of course, the same can be said for COVID-19.
Uh-huh.
So that suggests to me that we need to use different types of data, draw upon different types of data, to collect different types of data, to really get to the bottom of some of the big questions that we've got in relation to these topics. And that's seen me collect qualitative data, which I must say is rather, historically has been quite unusual for psychologists because we like to see ourselves as scientists and we like to deal with numbers. But there's a lot that can be learned from qualitative data, like the depth of one's experience. We can look in detail at a particular phenomenon that we perhaps don't already have much data around. But I've also collected data that are highly quantitative, where we're trying to quantify often very complex psychological phenomena like self-esteem. How do we find a numerical value to self-esteem? Well, it's challenging, but my argument is that only really makes sense if you've also got a qualitative dimension to it. So that's why I like to use different types of data. Now, I could go into a bit more detail, which I'm sure we will during our conversation, about the different types of qualitative data that we have and the different types of quantitative data. But your original question was, which is most important. And I guess I'd say that the quantitative data have enabled me to make more convincing assertions about larger groups of people, because often what we're trying to do when we collect quantitative data is to say something about general trends across a large group of people. And that brings us one step closer to generalizing our findings beyond the sample. And I think that's important. But there are many caveats that I'm sure we'll talk about in relation to generalizing data or findings from data.
I think that's very, very interesting that blending that kind of qualitative to validate quantitative and vice versa. Right? I hear that particularly in some areas, not all areas of market research. Could you maybe talk a little bit? You talked about, some challenges and boy, putting a number on self-esteem, quite right. I mean, even a clustered. But can you talk about a little bit some of the challenges that you face in making sure that the data you and your teams collect is useful for and usable for you? I mean, ensuring it's clean, ensuring it's intact, and ensuring it can actually be used to test the hypotheses that you want to test.
Yes, Sam, I must say these questions keep me up at night, and I'll tell you why. As a psychologist and as a fellow of the British Psychological Society, I'm aware of the power that psychologists and many other social scientists possess in terms of affecting change in society. Often policymakers will rely upon the findings that we generate in our research. Therefore, it makes the responsibility an enormous one. The responsibility to get it right is a significant one. That's why I said that it keeps me up at night, because actually there is much scope, as we already discussed, for error when we're developing our research questions, when we're designing a study, and when we collect our data and when we analyze those data. But to address your question more directly, I try to triangulate my findings. So I will, of course, use measures to try and measure really complex constructs like self-esteem and self-efficacy and things like that have already been validated in other research where possible. But I will try and also triangulate the findings using other methods. And that was the point that I was making a moment ago. So if you can also collect data using a different sample, preferably in a different cultural context, that's very good. But also if you can collect some qualitative data, that can help you also to ensure that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. Because I'm also really mindful of something, Sam, and that is that your results, what you get out of your statistical analysis package, is as good as what you put into the research. So it depends on the instruments that you've used to collect your data. And you need to be very transparent about those instruments when you report your research findings. You need to tell your reader how it is that you've measured self-esteem. Is it just using a single item, a single question, or is it actually tapping into different dimensions of self-esteem with a multitude of questions? That's really important. You need to also be able to report things like the reliability scores, how correlated your items are with one another. So all of these things are really important. But thankfully, I think a responsible researcher, and my colleagues most certainly are, will have a checklist that they'll go through to ensure that they are doing everything that's humanly possible, that we're using every technique that we're aware of as researchers to ensure that we are collecting robust data, and then that we're analysing those data as we should be and effectively.
You talk about, and I don't like to hear anything keeping anybody awake at night, but it's good to hear that those questions do. And you've mentioned obviously being a psychologist, fellow BPS, and policymakers relying on findings. Does the replicability crisis in psychology, does that keep you awake at night? The fact that, in case our readers aren't familiar, the fact that so many psychological experiments might have been conducted maybe using the acronym WEIRD, the white, educated, industrialized samples. Does that worry you? I mean, it sounds like don't want to answer the question for you. It sounds like that you're looking, when you're saying go to another cultural context or use everything humanly possible, it sounds like you're trying to mitigate those factors.
Yes, absolutely. The first thing is it does keep me up at night, because I'm aware that we, on the one hand, have aspirations, and sometimes quite difficult to achieve aspirations, to be able to say something meaningful about human beings. I'm talking about what we try and do as psychologists. I want to be able to say something about human beings in general. But that has to be balanced against the constraints that we face when we conduct research. We often conduct research with limited or even no funding, and that limits the scope for collecting large data from large samples that are cross-cultural samples across different geographical and cultural contexts. So in a nutshell, we often rely upon our own students, and we will often collect data from willing first year, second year, third year students who, in exchange for course credits. Now, of course, that presents a number of challenges, because if you think about the demographic or the main demographics of university students, well, many universities are not very diverse. They tend to represent particular sections of society in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of so many other characteristics. So we already have a sample that's not really very representative. So you're quite right that I try my very best to conduct research in a wide range of contexts and to triangulate the findings by looking at differences between groups. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But we have to also acknowledge that that's not always going to be possible. And where it's not possible, I reiterate, it's so important for us to be transparent about why that wasn't possible, what the limitations of our research are, and also to present very clearly future directions for research, because students will be looking at, and future researchers will be looking at research with a view to being inspired. And we can inspire them by being very clear about what the limitations of our research are, so that they can actually try and address them. And actually, Sam, some of the most exciting research I've done has been in collaboration with my PhD students, who happen to be from countries where a particular phenomenon is under-researched. Let me give you an example of that. I've done a lot of work around mental health among LGBT populations. I have students from Lebanon and Iran, where there's a great deal of stigma around LGBT populations, and therefore doing research into those topics is very difficult indeed. Yet they are starting to do that research, and therefore completing some of that very complex jigsaw puzzle, really, but by adding in pieces that reflect their own cultures.